I have talked a lot about BeOS and Haiku in this channel recently, but not nearly as much about their applications. And the application ecosystem is the final test every operating system eventually has to face. So in this final installment, it is time to look at the software ecosystem for BeOS and Haiku and to briefly see where the Linux-based VitruvianOS fits into the BeOS legacy. Under the dust, there's history waiting to boot. I'm the Vintage Collector and these are my stories. Let's take IBM's OS2 as an example. It once had a substantial native application library with an estimated 1500 to 2000 native titles by the mid-1990s. But that was still small compared with the vastly larger DOS and Windows software world, which had already grown into the tens of thousands. Apple too had to learn the hard way during the Rhapsody transition that they could not simply confine existing applications to the Blue Box environment while forcing all new software to be written exclusively for the Yellow Box API. It would have simply cost them too much by leaving thousands of existing applications behind. For BeOS, whose first general public release only arrived in 1997 after years of development, the situation was even worse. It entered the market that was already dominated by DOS and Windows on the PC side and by the Macintosh on the other. It's hard to estimate the exact number of native BeOS applications by the year 2000. BBits listed 2,292 category entries in mid-2000, but that raw figure included drivers, system components and at least some duplicate cross-listings. And when looking at surviving BeOS software samplers, the same inflation shows up again. This CD-ROM title, as an example, contains roughly 530 packages but drops to around 380 once duplicate versions. Older, newer releases, source packages and platform variants are cleaned out. So a safer estimate is that the actual number of native BeOS applications by mid-2000 was probably somewhere around 1700. Even that would still have placed BeOS well below the software scale of contemporary Linux distributions and far below the enormous Windows software world, whose application base at that time was already vastly larger than anything BeOS could realistically compete with. Now, one thing I wanted to look into was not just the original applications on BeOS, but also how they would fare on Haiku. You may remember that, although it completely failed during my direct hardware install attempts on the 2009 Mac Mini, the 32-bit version of Haiku was built with BeOS binary compatibility as a primary goal. So instead of only trying this in virtual machines, I gave it a shot on this 2007 Asus EeePC 701. This seemed like a good opportunity to put the compatibility claim to the test on real hardware. Now, Haiku does generally run on the EeePC, but not without some issues of its own. The built-in Ethernet is recognized and it even receives an IP address, but every attempt to actually communicate over the network fails. And Wi-Fi does not work at all. So with an external Ethernet adapter to the rescue, I finally had network connectivity, which was very welcome for transferring over some applications from my file server. First, I installed an old BeOS version of VLC, which did run. And in contrast to my 2009 Mac Mini experience, sound worked too, although with some noticeable stuttering, at least unless I kept moving the mouse pointer. That made me wonder whether there was a problem specific to VLC, so I also tried Haiku's stock media player, only to run into the same issue there as well. speaking of old BeOS applications, remember my previous episode where I mentioned the unofficial German BeOS offspring called Zeta.
Alles auf einer CD-ROM installiert sich in 15 Minuten, auf der ältesten Hardware, auch auf super neuen Computern. In 15 Minuten installiert, mit Word, mit Excel, mit...
When they advertised Zeta on Shopping TV, they claimed it would install in just 15 minutes, including Word and Excel. Of course, Zeta did not include Microsoft Office because that was never ported to BeOS. What it actually included was Gobe Productive, the only commercially available office productivity suite ever released for BeOS. Now, a short excursion into Gobe software. The company was founded in 1997 by former ClarisWorks developers and released the first version of Gobe Productive for BeOS in 1998. Gobe later even became the North American distributor for BeOS, which is why you can still find Gobe branded BeOS CD-ROM images on archive.org and elsewhere. And with the failure of BeInc and BeOS, Gobe eventually tried to carry Gobe Productive over to Windows and Linux as well, even porting parts of the BeOS API along with it. You can see proof of that in files like libbe.dll in the Windows version, and yes, it totally runs on React OS too. Although Gobe did ship the Windows version in late 2001, it was unable to obtain sufficient operating capital after the 2000 stock market crash and the company dissolved in 2002. Back to Gobe Productive on BeOS, I finally wanted to put it to the test and see how well it will fare on Haiku. Unfortunately, Haiku refused to mount the BeOS formatted CD-ROM that contains the professional version of Gobe Productive. But it did launch the installer for the trial version, and it also ran the program without any complaint. I eventually also found a Japanese BeOS software distribution, which includes an English copy of Gobe Productive. And this one works too on Haiku. If only that same were true for all BeOS applications. Even smaller apps like Mahjong or bCommander, and even old file sharing software like Napster, which run fine on BeOS itself, simply crash on Haiku. BPDF and Opera also bail out immediately. Then again, who would seriously want to run a 25-year-old version of Opera and BPDF on Haiku today when more recent software is available anyway? Because on modern Haiku you do have access to a fairly large library of ported and widely used open source applications. That does not necessarily make them native Haiku software, of course. Even back in the day on BeOS, many applications were not really native to BeOS at all, but ports from elsewhere. Mozilla and Opera are obvious examples, and neither of them exactly hides its foreign origin. And as far as Haiku's BeOS binary compatibility is concerned, the experience still feels a bit hit or miss. Here we have the old BeOS port of Abbey Word and Haiku, but well, never mind, the modern port works instead. And in all fairness, Haiku today does have access to a decent range of modern software. There are several browsers available, and on 64-bit Haiku you can even get a relatively recent port of Iceweasel. Some developers have even gone as far as creating new software specifically for Haiku, including the non-linear video editor Meadow. Why does that matter? Because BeOS was once promoted as the Media OS. And yet, some of the better known BeOS media applications, like Personal Studio, unfortunately do not seem to run on Haiku. That also brings us back to all the commercial software that BeInc so prominently announced in the late 1990s. Names like Steinberg's Nuendo, Imagic's Logic Audio and Maxon's Cinema 4D gave BeOS credibility on paper and in some cases were shown in demos or pre-release showcases. There was only one problem: most of it never actually shipped. And once B changed strategy in early 2000, pulling back from the desktop market and going all in on internet appliances, outside interest in developing software for BeOS dwindled even further. Even products that appeared close to competition, like Cinema 4D, were ultimately held back. And Final Scratch, although originally developed on BeOS, only ever appeared as a pre-release there, before eventually being released for Windows and Linux instead. There was, however, one particular notable commercial title that really did ship for BeOS, and it was a game: Civilization: Call to Power. The BeOS version was announced by Wildcard Design in June 1999 and released in March 2000. And once again, no luck on Haiku, at least not here. And my first attempt on BeOS was not much more successful either. As it turned out, this one was simply a matter of having enough RAM. Once I bumped the virtual machine up to 128 MB, the game finally ran. Of course, other games had been ported as well, among them Quake and, of course, Doom. Some sources claim even SimCity 3000 was once planned to be ported. Besides, there was still a number of other commercial applications available from BDepot, such as Trax, ObjectSynth and BCasso. But it quickly becomes clear that the lack of a broader software library was part of the bigger problem. Even if we also count the many open source and freeware applications, it still was not enough to create lasting momentum. And that was probably obvious to many of the people who downloaded BeOS 5 Personal Edition when it arrived in 2000. Even with reportedly more than 1 million downloads, the lack of software was not enough to turn most curious first-time users into permanent BeOS users. Still, it clearly resonated with some people, and that is why, even after the downfall of BE Inc., a number of BeOS successors emerged, with Haiku becoming by far the longest lived of them, now carrying the torch for more than 20 years. More recent developments include VitruvianOS, a Linux-based system that tries to combine Linux's broad hardware support with a BeOS-inspired userland and runtime. At the heart of it is Nexus, a custom set of kernel modules that bridge the Linux kernel with the BeOS and Haiku runtime APIs and subsystems. So much so that even the BeOS desktop, including deskbar and tracker, runs in place of a traditional Linux desktop environment. But even in the early 2026 builds, that effort still seems to be in a very rough state. The system boots far enough to bring up a graphical interface, but not into anything I would call a usable desktop. In both VirtualBox and VMware, the interface did appear, but the screen would not update properly, at least not until I repeatedly switched to the text console and back again using the usual hotkeys. So by moving the mouse in roughly the right direction and clicking more or less blindly, I could at least bring up the About dialog. We will see where that road ultimately leads, but there is clearly still enough motivation in the community to keep trying new directions. And in that regard, VitruvianOS does have one very strong argument on its side: hardware support. I'm looking forward to exploring that again at a later time. But for now, this is where my BeOS exploration comes to an end. What about you? Which BeOS application stood out to you the most? Let me know in the comments below. I'm the Vintage Collector, and this was my story for today. Thanks for watching, and see you again next Sunday.